Hi, everybody. Today we're talking about love and romantic relationships. And to talk about that, we need to mention and bring up and discuss key trends and themes that are related to love and relationships in the modern context, particularly in the United States. First, we need to talk about dating. Now, there's a lot of discussion today about, well, does dating still exist? Is dating dead? And really, the textbook does a great job of reminding us that a lot of the controversies around dating have been, in a sense, out there for generations. It's not just this brand new thing where people are just sort of wondering about what the ultimate status of dating actually is. So we'll see that dating, of course, does still happen, although it probably happens with much more nuance and, in some cases, specificity than it was known to have in the past. But nevertheless, uh, in its truest form, it still exists. At the same time, the form that dating should be, that it should take, and its ability to sort of set the stage for the future of a relationship is a lot less certain. And so we know that dating goes on, although it's got a shape that's a little different. Again, more nuance and more specificity than what we've seen in past generations. And it may or may not signal or have something to do with what eventually happens to a couple or to some kind of, if you will, relationship circumstance. Also, we have to talk about cohabitation, what some people often refer to as shacking up. In spite of how vague dating has become in terms of what stage does it signal about a relationship from one date to the next, cohabitation has emerged really as a much firmer sort of assertion of what a relationship ultimately is. It's a stronger sign of the maturity ultimately of a relationship. More than 70% of eventually married couples cohabit, and it's common for individuals to experience multiple cohabiting circumstances. We often refer to this in the literature as serial cohabitation. And so living together unmarried is the norm, not the exception, with respect to, if you will, varieties of long term relationships, some of which do eventually become marital relationships. Also, there's a great diversity of marital status. Really, as the stigma of divorce and older singlehood has waned, generally divorced persons and older singles, they are expected to blend in and are regarded as a key demographic in the single population. So there isn't necessarily differential or separate treatment, if you will, for those who were married prior or that might be over 50 within the dating scene or the dating market, so to speak. Also, we can't leave out one key theme: technology. As in the case of the larger economy, technology is available to us. So we have all kinds of apps that are meant for dating and relationships of one kind or another, either for brief encounters that are going to be largely sexual in nature, like Grindr or Tinder, those sorts of apps and how they're based, in addition to other kinds of more relational based apps like OkCupid, for instance, or Our Time. A lot of those sorts of availabilities have changed what dating and relationships are about, at very least in terms of their approach and how we approach them. So they've dramatically shaped the experience, the perception, and the opportunities that can occur and do occur within dating and the dating scene. Now, we also need to talk about love, and we really look at it in two ways within this topic and within this chapter. So, with love, we're talking ultimately, generally, about an active, deep affection and concern for another that's anchored in a emotional bond. And so that's what we tend to think about when we think of the attributes of love and what love is all about. And so we can break that down in this discussion in two ways. We often, with this kind of discussion, we are led to think about the romantic form of love first. So here's where you have this rich, deep passion, this passionate devotion, this attraction to the other person, if you will. And it's typically seen in our society as a precondition for a relationship. This is a more recent phenomenon, so I would say within the past 400 or so years is when we've really seen, particularly for Western society, where norms of romantic love and romantic notions have asserted themselves as needing to be there before a relationship is actually declared. So again, romantic love is culturally based and it's historically based. And so the expressions of it, and in a sense, where it appears in a relationship, let alone in the culture, varies from time to time and from place to place. But again, if you're looking at Western societies, Europe, the United States, if you're looking largely there, you'll see it generally is a way of saying, okay, we're on the road to something much more permanent, the presence of this sort of romantic love and romantic notion. However, that's also balanced by, and if in a lot of cases couples are fortunate, it's accompanied by what we call utilitarian love. This is where we dedicate ourselves to another person in ways that are rational and practical. There's commitment involved in terms of emotional commitment, but there's also a behavioral intent to be here, to show up, and to not necessarily only be around for the sexy stuff, but for the things that really matter, like paying bills, getting taxes done, making sure the kids are fed and dressed. So, in a sense, the more doing of the love itself, the more demonstrative aspects of it. Again, utility, it's really all about work. So anytime you see that sort of reference to something being utility or utilitarian, we're ultimately talking about the work and the work that is involved in the relationship. It's rooted in this sort of cost-benefit dynamic, if you will, that exchange theory reminds us of. So it's with utilitarian aspects of love, we're often looking at a sort of this for that. And so that's a big part of what happens. We know that if we put in a certain amount of regular, routine effort within our love relationships, that we will likely get the same back. And so norms of reciprocity are also much, much more important with respect to utilitarian aspects of love. Often the most successful long-term relationships, they actively manage both romantic and utilitarian love aspects and attributes of the relationship. And so that can be, in a lot of respects, where the relationship, if it has trouble, begins to break down, where there's a sort of imbalance between the romantic, passionate, hopeful, optimistic aspects of love, of being swept away in those kinds of things, when there's an imbalance of that as well as the utilitarian aspects. And so you really have to have both. And so you need to see romantic love and the utilitarian love as a package deal, that you've got to have both, and that they are mutually reinforcing, not necessarily competing. In the ideal circumstance, in the ideal romantic relationship, they're going to be mutually reinforcing, so that as romantic love occurs, utilitarian love can be observed and vice versa. And so they really set the stage for feeding the relationship in its entirety. Now, we need to also talk more about dating. So the dating system generally emerged about a century ago. And so the system of being able to go out with perhaps multiple folks without having some sort of commitment to any one person at that particular time. And so again, this really, if you will, emerged around the early 20th century, in the early 1920s in particular. And so at that time, there were concerns that this dating system was a threat to marriage, and that it would rock the established order of what courtship ultimately used to be. And so today we're still having that conversation. So some people wonder about, well, not only is dating not only bad, but is this something that just should be avoided, period, altogether? And so that's a big part of what we're looking at often with respect to how people react to the notions of hooking up, and that being a descriptor for how people get together today. The notion of, okay, we're going to get together for this sexual exchange, this romantic exchange that may be brief, it may be momentary, that doesn't necessarily lead to something else much more permanent. So quite frankly, we'll see that in a lot of respects, a lot of the hooking up today is very similar to what actually was established in the past. Regardless of approach or form or what era we're talking about, research shows overwhelmingly that dating is positive, that dating experiences are good for us, that they're associated with better health outcomes, and that a lot of this health association with dating. A lot of this starts really in adolescence. And so steady dating with adolescence is correlated with self-esteem. Generally, we know that those who date, people who are dating, are in better shape than non-daters. So it's a positive kind of thing. And that doesn't mean that in every case that it cures your whatever ails you. It's not that simple as, okay, well, if I go on these dates, I'll be in better shape. It's not necessarily that direct. It's probably more like a salt and pepper relationship, where as you see one, you see the other. They sort of go together. So generally, as you see healthier people within society, more than likely they are availing themselves of some kind of dating relationship, right? We know that today dates still do occur, and so we're now looking at some of the themes concerning dating currently within our culture. Dates still occur with great frequency, despite much disagreement over what they mean. And so the chapter talks about at the very beginning scripts and social scripts, and what these really are. These are ways within which we sort of organize the social world in terms of, oh, okay, well, this happened before, so here's a blueprint for a script for ultimately what's going to happen later. So dating today, and not that it was necessarily that much clearer in the past, but dating today certainly has a much greater variety of interpretations, a much greater variety of subjectivity, including the prospect of people getting together briefly for hookups that don't really have or require some kind of emotional commitment despite the reality of physical connection. So people are still going out, they're still availing themselves of each other in these smaller dyadic circumstances of two people. Again, it happens, but there may be much more controversy or much less agreement about what it actually is all about. We also know that dating takes place ultimately in the market. That's one of the big themes we also have to talk about as well. Dating is influenced by consumption patterns. So when folks go out, they are, if you will, engaging the economy in some fashion. They're going out to restaurants. They're going out to bars. They're patronizing these kinds of establishments on a regular basis. And so they become inputs, if you will, into the prospect of having and ultimately managing whatever kind of dating relationship or relationships that we're trying to have. It's also by going out, it's a way for a couple, perhaps, if they're thinking about becoming a bit more firm, a bit more permanent about their relationship, it's a way that they can sort of publicly test it out by going out and perhaps being seen just casually by friends and associates and introducing those people to your date. That's a way of sort of testing the waters and seeing, oh, all right, well, hey, would this work hypothetically in some sort of sense of permanence? So that's a way where, again, the market allows us to have these experiences, but they also bring us something else that isn't necessarily purely based on an economic transaction. Also, gender roles matter. Another key theme within dating, particularly for straight folks, that gender roles indeed do matter. In straight relationships, men are expected today to still take the lead despite widespread egalitarian beliefs concerning dating and marriage and family. And so that also, the duality of, in a sense, men having to play double agent in straight relationships, of having to be much more in a sense of a take charge kind of mode. They have to be in that mode, but at the same time they have to respect egalitarian norms that exist, that are widespread throughout the society and culture. And so that dance of that blending and that melding of scripts, that often is a challenge for straight relationships and relationships of all kinds, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. And so in a lot of respects, the more successful relationships will find ways to manage expectations. They'll find ways to realize that, hey, we might have different ideas about what this is all about. So why don't we, in a sense, communicate what they are to each other, flesh them out. And I've said this too in the teaching of human sexuality, that often the more successful couples develop their own rules. They develop their own sense of understanding of what an ideal relationship would actually be about and what the ideal approaches would be about. And so the same could also be said for gender roles as well. Now, sex ratios. And so with sex ratios, this being another theme concerning dating, we're talking ultimately about what percentage of men to women or women to men there are in a particular area or region. And what we know about college campuses today is that the sex ratios are generally imbalanced. Although colleges were established, of course, well over 400 years ago as bastions of white male authority and prominence and privilege. And so we know today that disproportionately women are the greater percentage of college students today. So typically on a community college campus in particular, you're looking at about 60% or more of the students being female. With your four-year institutions, you're looking at about 55 to 60% of the students being female versus male. So in straight relationships with women enrolling at greater proportionality, it does enhance men's bargaining powers within if you will, relationships of all kinds on campuses. And so that can also lead into the discussion of what hooking up actually is another theme of dating today. And so the hooking up, these notions of meeting together and having sexual relationships without commitment, again, a lot of what happens today concerning hooking up is not necessarily that radically different from how dating emerged 100 years ago. So in a lot of respects, I would say even the hooking up culture today has still more in common with dating as a whole than being something new and completely different. A lot of what I would say in the background influencing hooking up can actually often be is social inequality. And so we talked about that particularly looking at the movie Inequality for All last week, but also looking at issues of social class in our society as well, and social class and how they impact families. And so we know that today, increasingly, we need higher education. We have to have higher education. We have to have some kind of specialized skill in order to be gainfully employed and to get good jobs that would pay enough to support a family. And so, in a way, hooking up, ironically, can support that process for some people. In some ways, it may be seen as a rational choice. And so for a lot of young college students of traditional age, the idea may be, well, I can maximize by hooking up. I can experience physical intimacy without the commitment that might bog me down and take me away from my studies. Because again, being taken away from one's studies, that can threaten future prospects for employment, future success in terms of career, and so forth. And so I think that is what a lot of students are grappling with today, that there are challenges ultimately to what is happening to families, to communities, to society in general, and that I have to play my cards right. And then the hooking up prospect may allow someone to play their cards in a sense better, not necessarily right, but play them better so that they are ultimately investing still in themselves more than they might be investing in a relationship that isn't necessarily guaranteed to work out. Now, that may seem cruel, it may seem harsh, and again, it may seem like a rational choice. But again, as sociology, what we do is we hold up a mirror to society. We don't simply dictate or say what society should ultimately be like. We try to be value free, and again, we are making attempts to understand what society is ultimately about. And so this is one way that we can go about trying to understand what the hookup culture is all about. Again, another big theme within dating, and we had talked about this before, just a general theme in terms of love and relationships, as well as technology. Internet-based dating has been around now for over a quarter century, and so we're looking at Match.com being the earliest dating-oriented website established right in 1995. And so again, you're looking at that 25 years ago, that this was sort of the watershed moment for what online dating and technologically based dating would be like. We know now today that at least 1 in 4 young adults have met someone, have been using online dating websites. So we're seeing, and the book talks about this, that the more traditional arenas wherein people meet at bars, at coffee shops, at church, mosque, synagogue, that a lot of those more traditional spaces are declining in importance in terms of how people meet to facilitate relationships. And so in a lot of respects, the efficiency of online meeting portals, if you will, is beating out some of the more traditional kinds of places where people have paired off for dating and relationships. At the same time, there are challenges to online dating. We realize that in a lot of cases, people aren't necessarily honest about who or what they are with respect to their identities, their profiles. And so research has shown that in about a third of these, people can be very mendacious. They may lie about what they actually look like, use wrong or deliberately use pictures that are not themselves, or maybe one that's from another time where they looked a certain way, where they thought that they looked better. So despite that prospect of deception, again, people realize that dating in a lot of respects is a numbers game. And so over time, chances are, if you stick with it, be it technologically based or otherwise, there's a good sense that things will pay off in the long run. In terms of diversity, that's a great theme also with respect to dating to take a look at and think about. Singles today are generally older, so that's one thing to keep in mind, that age at first marriage is really around the late 20s if we're looking at straight marriage. And so the data, I'm sure, for gay and lesbian marriage are also similar, despite how briefly we've had gay and lesbian marriage. Again, we're looking at similar trends with respect to folks getting higher education as a priority out there first before they decide to get married. So that's right there one of the big things that we can see, that again, people being in their 20s, late 30s, late 40s, being out there, that's a lot different from what we have seen in prior cohorts and generations. And so singles today are generally older, they're more likely to be highly educated, they have a range of sexual orientation and gender identities, and they also may be actively parenting or are parents, and they, in many cases, are divorced, or they might even be separated going through the process of divorce. And so there's a lot more, in a sense, to sort of weave through and sift through, although the great thing about that is you do have more options and more opportunity in that sifting through and weaving through process. And of course, last but certainly not least, we cannot leave out that there's great inequality with respect to the prospects for marriage, mate selection, and love and relationships. Although we have more favorable attitudes now towards interracial dating and interracial relationships, we also know that, for instance, African Americans, within the dating scene, they're the most isolated group within the United States dating scene. And so, quite frankly, we have this notion of, hey, that's a good thing. People should be able to do that. But at the same time, again, we're looking at social isolation happening in ways perhaps technologically based that are also consistent with the isolation we see between communities in terms of, again, we are a very segregated society. We typically live next to somebody who's the same race as ourselves. And so that segregation, particularly for African Americans, having the highest degrees of segregation geographically, we're seeing this sort of repeated within the prospect of mate selection, dating, and eventually marriage. We also see within straight relationships that straight women are still expected to alter and change their appearance, their bodies, to enhance their attractive aspects and their attractiveness. They're expected to do that a lot more than men are expected to. And so despite the fact that we do have and embrace more egalitarian norms, we still see significant gender inequality, especially with respect to straight relationships.